Welcome to the annual Clissold lecture. My name is Mark Rayner, in case you don't know who I am. I'm the program coordinator of the Master of Media in Journalism and Communications program. That's not the hardest thing I'm going to say tonight. And so we're here to sort of celebrate journalism, and the evening is really to talk about something that we feel is very topical and important, and I think we're very lucky to have Tanya Talaga here as our guest speaker. Before we do that, though, there's a few things I just need to say. One of them is just to acknowledge that our beautiful campus here at Western is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and the Adirondack peoples. They all have long-standing relations to the land of southwestern Ontario and the City of London. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewa of the Thames, First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, Munsee Delaware Nation, and in the region there are 11 First Nation communities and a growing Indigenous urban population. Western values the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original peoples of Turtle Island. And before we get to Tanya, I think I should tell you a little bit about the Clissold history. I'll try to keep it really short. This is turning into really quite a history of great journalism in Canada. So I'll just give you a short list of some of the people who've come to speak before. Rosie Barton, Craig Silverman, Lyndon McIntyre, Gwyn Dyer, Linda McQuaig, Michelle Shepard. They've all come to speak here. That's just a few of them. All of that is made possible by a bequest from New York architect Robert Blunt and his wife Rose. And it's called the Clissold Lecture because Blunt's grandfather was Edward Clissold, who was a journalist who worked here in London at the London Advertiser. He spent his whole life working in journalism, and he ended up finishing his career at the London Advertiser. That's back from when, the Free Press had competition in shape of another daily newspaper. And so he spent 30 years at London. And so I think it makes sense to have this lecture here. But on to tonight's speaker. So Tanya Talaga has been a journalist at the Toronto Star for 20 years. She's covered everything from general city news to education, national health care, foreign news, Indigenous affairs. She's been nominated 5 times for the Michener Award in Public Service Journalism, which is amazing. In 2013, she was part of a team that won a National Newspaper Award for a year-long project on the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. And in 2015, she was part of a team that won a National Newspaper Award for Gone, which was a series of stories on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Currently, she's the 2017-2018 Atkinson Fellow in Public Policy. And as you can tell, she's got her book here for sale, so after the lecture you'll have a chance to buy that. She's been promoting the book, which is a very powerful story, and has won the RBC Taylor Prize, and it's called 7 Fallen Feathers. Yeah, congratulations. Tanya is of Polish and Indigenous descent. Her great-grandmother, Liz Gauthier, was a residential school survivor. Her great-grandfather, Russell Bowen, was an Ojibwe trapper and laborer. Her grandmother is a member of Fort William First Nation. Got that right? Her mother was raised in Wraith and Graham, Ontario, and Talaga lives in Toronto with her 2 teenage children, one of whom is here today. I picked on you, William, sorry. And please join me in welcoming her this evening.
Bushu, Anin, thank you very much for having me here today. It's always a pleasure coming to Western and coming to London. I'm happy to be here on Anishinaabe territory. And thank you for also having my son here. He's 16, and we're doing a little bit of a tiny tour on universities. So that's why he's here. And it's actually kind of a funny story, but the first time he heard me speak, it's been a while, it was my very first talk with the book, or one of my very first talks, and I didn't know what to do with a microphone. It was an earpiece that goes around your ear, and I actually stuck it in my ear. And thank goodness there were only 4 people at the talk, and it was at the basement of the Kitchener Library. My son and my daughter were 2 of the 4 people at the talk. And they, of course, were just killing themselves laughing because I was up there trying to stick the microphone in my ear. So I hope I've gotten a little bit better as time goes on. Luckily, I'm wearing it. So I have many things to say this evening, and I'm glad you're all here because I'm sure you're probably all wondering about the title of my talk too. My talk is, for a journalist, is an interesting title. I talk about rights before reconciliation and how I report in Indigenous communities. I'm also, besides being a journalist, I'm also now an author of a nonfiction book, 7 Fallen Feathers. And the bulk of my talk tonight is going to be on that. And I should also tell you, too, that I talk in circles. I like to say it's cultural, actually. But I usually have a point. And if you bear with me, you will eventually get to my points. And you'll see where I'm going and where I'm leading you in my circles and in my path. And it's actually kind of like my book. And while I mentioned earlier, too, that I'm an author as well, it's really important for you to know, because I know this is a talk about journalism, and my book is very much a work of journalism in a way, but I also picked a side. When you're a journalist, you can't do that, right? You have to walk down a thin line. You have to be very black and white. Writing a nonfiction book is a little bit different. The book is very much based on facts and interviews, so many interviews. Everything is taken from transcripts or live interviews with people. But you can see that I'm definitely trying to tell a story of a certain way. And the more I tell you about myself, too, and how I came to this, you'll come to understand why I wrote this book and why I think, in some ways, too, that the book found me. Because, 7 Fallen Feathers is not also just a book about Thunder Bay and racism in Thunder Bay. It's really a book about Canada, and this is one of my circles. It's a story about Canada's past. It's a story about erased and ignored history. And it's a story of how the misdeeds of the past have contributed to the deaths of the 7 students in Thunder Bay and how they went ignored for so long. It's also a story, though, of Canada's present. This story, what's happening in Thunder Bay, I argue, every time I do speak, you see this happening across the country. You see this happening with the death of Colton Bushy. You see this with a subsequent trial of Gerald Stanley and his acquittal. I also see it, too, with the death of Tina Fontaine in Winnipeg and the acquittal of Cormier. So, for all these reasons, this is a book really of the history of now. And I'm going to sort of tell you how I got to that point as a journalist. And it's been a long time. I've been on this journey with this book. It started in 2011 for me, so it's been, my goodness, 7 years now. Sometimes good stories take a long time. My story begins in Thunder Bay, of course, and I'm going to tell you why. You heard a little bit about it earlier because you heard a little bit about me and who I am and where my mother is from. My father was Polish. My mom is of Eastern European and Ojibwe background. Her mom is a member of Fort William First Nation. She was raised outside of Fort William, a little place called Wraith. Fast forward to 2011, and it's a federal election, and I'm a reporter in Toronto. I work at the Toronto Star, and in 2011, I was part of the parliamentary desk. I was a national reporter, and I worked at Queen's Park. 2011 was the year of the federal election, if you might recall. It was the year that Stephen Harper was kind of battling it out against Jack Layton. And if you're a reporter in politics, the one story you want to be on when there's a federal election is actually the federal election. And since I was kind of the newbie in at Queen's Park, the Ontario Provincial Parliament, I really had no hope in hell of getting onto this story. The only way I was going to do it was if I could actually think of a way to get myself inserted in there by coming up with my own story ideas. And that's sort of what I did. I mentioned to my editors, you know, I think it'd be a really good idea if we did a story about why it is Indigenous people don't like to vote in federal elections. 2011 is before the release of the TRC report. It is before Idle No More. It is before sort of the proliferation of what we're seeing now with Indigenous news on social media, on Facebook, and also too with CBC Indigenous, which has been a really big player in helping to get all of our stories out. So when I mentioned to my editor this story idea, my editor thought that it was really exotic. It's different. What a good angle. Why don't you do that story? And so I decided that I would go to Thunder Bay. I pitched to go to Thunder Bay. And a word of advice to any young journalist that's out there, if you pitch to go away on a plane involving hotels and rent-a-cars, you better make sure you come back with a story that you go up to where you're going. Let's just say I still haven't handed in that 2011 story on the federal election. Don't tell anybody that, though. I think I just broadcasted it everywhere. So I said to my editors, I need to go to Thunder Bay. These are the reasons why I know Thunder Bay a little bit more, and I also need to go and talk to Stan Verity. And Stan Verity at the time was the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe-Aski Nation. Anishinaabe-Aski Nation is a political organization of 49 northern First Nations north of Thunder Bay, stretch on a territory that's roughly the size of the country of France. You can see it up here, really. It stretches from Thunder Bay, it's right around there, over to James Bay, up to Hudson Bay, and then west to the Manitoba border. It's really quite an awesome, wild, large territory. There are about 45,000 people living in this territory, and the political office is in Thunder Bay, and that's why I went to Thunder Bay to go see Stan. We sat down, and it was we had a really interesting exchange, because he was sitting, and then I was sitting beside him, and I started to ask my questions about the election. I started with an overarching question, which is always a good thing to do when you're doing an interview. And I said, Stan, why is it people in Northern Ontario are not voting? And he looked at me and he said, why aren't you writing a story about Jordan LaBosse? And then I thought, oh, clearly he didn't hear me. So I repeated my question again. And again, he looked at me and he said, Jordan has been missing for 70 days. So it became clear to me that we were having two different conversations. I was trying to ask him questions about why I came there. He was trying to tell me something, and I wasn't listening. And we went on like this, tossing back and forward, having two different conversations for about 10 minutes before I realized I really needed to just sort of calm down, put my manic Toronto Star journalist self aside, remember who I was, remember who he was, show some respect, and listen, because he is obviously trying to tell me something that was very important. And I like to think that at that point, I opened my ears and I listened to what he had to say. And what he told me was, at that point, that Jordan was the 7th student to go missing or to die in Thunder Bay since 2000. And when he said 7, I really couldn't believe it. And then he said to me, let me take you on a drive. So we got into his truck and we started driving, and he popped in a CD of gospel music. And I remember rolling my eyes and thinking, oh my gosh, Stan, what are we listening to? Stan looked at me and he said, when I listen to music about God, I feel closer to my son Daniel. His son Daniel was a star hockey player, a goalie, and he was beaten to death at a house party in Fort William First Nation. He was with his parents. He was their only son to go to high school in Thunder Bay while he was in Thunder Bay as Grand Chief. And it became apparent to me that as he told me the story of Daniel, and I started to hear more about the 7 students, I started to realize that this was a story of so much more. This was a story of how Stan couldn't keep his son safe, how we all can't keep our children safe in Northern Ontario. And why are they in Thunder Bay? They're in Thunder Bay because they have no high schools to go to in their home communities. Remember the map I showed you where everybody lived? Well, if you are a student living in one of the NAN communities, you basically have to move if you want to go to high school. You have to leave your family, leave your culture, leave your language, leave everything you know, and you have to go to Thunder Bay to school, or Sioux Lookout, or Timmins. That just doesn't happen just in Thunder Bay, by the way. It happens across Canada. This is part of my circle. I'm going to be coming back to this. And I'm going to tell you a little bit now about the students, but I'm also going to come back to them too. And you'll see how this all sort of fits in together. What really struck me at that point, there was a number of things as we were driving down to the water where we were going, was that the kids were coming so far away from everything they knew to go to high school. And at that point, it was 2011, and I kept thinking to myself, this is so weird, you know? It's the right of every single child in this country to go to high school. How come it's not for these kids? So we kept driving, and we arrived at the Kaministiquia River. Now, there are many, many rivers, water systems, tributaries that all feed into Lake Superior. Lake Superior is Gitchigami. It's a monster, really. It controls everything in the Thunder Bay area. It controls the weather. It controls everything really about your life. You can be outside one moment and there'll be a breeze coming and it's sunny and gorgeous out, and all of a sudden this massive wind will come off the lake and everything will go dark and the weather turns. It's quite an interesting spot. The Cam is one of the biggest rivers that feed into Lake Superior. And we stopped our truck eventually down by the banks at the Cam, and we got out of the truck, and I looked up and I saw Mount McKay, and I felt sick to my stomach. And I said to Stan, what are we doing here? And why I felt sick was because Mount McKay is my grandmother's reserve. And Mount McKay is where I have gone. I've gone with my children. My children have been up there. I've been to powwows there. And I just felt sick because I knew what Stan was going to say. And Stan said, of course, this is where we found a shoe of Jordan's, and this is where we think he was last seen alive. And within about a month and a half of us standing there at the banks of the Cam, Jordan's body would be found exactly where we were standing in the water. So these are the kids. Again, I will come back to them and tell you a little bit more about them as I go on. The first is Jethro Anderson. He's in the top left with the white Nike hat on. He was 15 years old. He just turned 15 on October 1st, 2000. And he was from Casablanca Lake First Nation. You know, in October of 2000, it was also a pivotal point because that was the opening of the First Nations High School in Thunder Bay, Dennis Franklin Cromartie. And it was a time of great joy. It was really, really cool, you know. The school had been put together so quick, but it was really needed. It was needed for all the kids so they could go to a high school, a First Nations high school within Thunder Bay. And it was a time of great joy, and nobody thought that within a month of the school opening, one of their students would go missing and would be later found dead in the water, McIntyre River, and Jethro was. Beside Jethro is Curren Trang. He's got the yellow hoodie on. And Curren was from Pikangikum First Nation. Pikangikum, I mentioned Pikangikum because at the time that Curren passed away in the water, Pikangikum was suffering with one of the highest youth suicide rates in the Western world. So he was going home a lot. He would be flown home to Pikangikum to attend family services, to attend memorials. He was dealing with a lot of things. And this is part of the reason that you need to know a little bit more about the students. And it's also part of the reason why I wrote the book, because you can't really fit all of these facts in sometimes when you're writing a newspaper article that's 450, 600, 800 words long. And I knew that people were not really getting the full story of who these kids are and where they come from and what they deal with day to day. Because when the kids come into Thunder Bay to go to high school, they bring everything with them. It doesn't get left on a plane or at home. Beside Curren is Paul Pannacheese, and he was the oldest. He was 21. And Paul had been to 10 different boarding houses. 10 different boarding houses trying to finish his high school education in Thunder Bay. Because you see what happens is when all the kids come in, they get put into boarding homes. And they're just, regular homes. Anyone can apply to be a family that takes in one of the students. There are background checks and everything else, but as you know, sometimes people don't get on, or sometimes it just doesn't work out. And so Paul had gone to many different homes until his mom, Marianne, awesome, amazing woman, said, you know what, that's it. I'm going to move from Mishka First Nation, where they live, 600 kilometers outside of Thunder Bay. I'm coming to Thunder Bay, I'm renting a house, and you're gonna finish high school. We're gonna do this. And sadly, Paul would die on our kitchen floor. And I'll tell you more about that later on. The only girl of the 7 was Robin Harper, and there she is on the right, and she's from a small community called Kiwewan First Nation. Kiwewan's about 350, 400 people, and Robin is one of 2 of the 7 students from Kiwewan, and that's quite a remarkable loss, 2 students from a community of 350 people. Reggie Bushy, he's down here on the bottom left. He was also 15 years old. He's from Poplar Hill First Nation. His case, his story is really, really important as well for many reasons. It was the 10-year anniversary of his death on November 1st, 2007. And his mom really spearheaded the call for Indigenous jury members on inquest juries in Northern Ontario. She actually asked her lawyers to stop the inquest proceedings because she wanted to make sure there were First Nations people on the jury. That's how many years ago now? See, here's one of my circles again, right? I'm talking about Colton Bushy as well. That did eventually happen, and I can talk a little bit about that more. Actually, all cases in Northern Ontario stalled for almost 5 years as they tried to figure out the jury question. And beside Reggie, with the earbuds and the hat that's backwards, that's Kyle Morrisseau. He's also from Kiwewan, so he's the 2nd student I was telling you about. And then there's Jordan with the gray hoodie on the far right, bottom right. And of course, Jordan is the one who brought me to this whole story. But as a journalist too, after Stan told me that, and after he took me to the water, I should tell you also that we got back into the truck, and then we drove to Dennis Franklin Camardi High School, the high school I was telling you about. 6 of the 7 students went to Dennis Franklin. Jordan was actually the only one that didn't. He went to Mattawa, which was inside Thunder Bay. It's a smaller school. But the reason why Stan took me to DFC is because he wanted me to talk to everyone at the school and get the story of who the kids are and sort of find out a little bit more about what they were experiencing every day in Thunder Bay. So it was one of these classic moments where Stan barges in the school, and we go to the administration offices, and we went to go see Jonathan Kekajemek, who was the principal at the time, and when Jonathan came out, Stan just dumped me there. He goes, "This is Tanya, she's Nish, tell her everything." And he was gone. And in about 6 hours later, he came to pick me up and take me to the airport. But I'm ever so grateful that he did that, because when I got back, my editors agreed with me that this is a big story, and the Star played it right, played it on the front page of the paper that It was in 2011. And that's the beginning of my journey. I started writing stories about what was going on at Thunder Bay. Do you remember how I said I worked at Queen's Park? So that was a big advantage to me because since I worked at Queen's Park, I had access to all the ministers. I would go to question period, I would be able to listen to them, and then when they were finished question period, I would be part of the scrums outside. So I would go up and ask them questions like, do you know what's going on at Thunder Bay? Do you know about the deaths of these kids? How come there is no inquest being called into the deaths of the kids? What had happened was an inquest was called into just Reggie's death. But Anishinaabe Nation and the families just could not believe that they would just call an inquest into one and not all the other kids. So that was something. It took a long time for the inquest to actually be called. And here's one of my circles again. Remember how I told you that all the kids had to leave their homes to go to high school. They had to leave their language, their culture, everything they know, to come to a different place, to go to school. This to me sounded a lot like something else that's happened in Canada's history for quite a long time, and that's of course the Indian residential school system. And this is, this is again where a book is so much more helpful than a newspaper article, because in a newspaper article I might get like a line or two in, even in a feature. But in a book, I could sort of go bigger and sort of explain the significance of the Indian residential school and how I see it all fitting in with the deaths of the 7 kids. So I'm just going to read you one of my favorite Sir John A. quotes. And as you can see, and as I think I said too, it was 150,000 kids attended these schools from the mid-1880s until 1996. Here's a quote. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with the parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Sir John A., 1883. Sort of set the tone. Fast forward from that time to a couple of years ago, actually right around this time of year, I had been writing newspaper articles on the 7, but I knew, as I said, that I wanted to do a book on it. But I sort of had to be in the right frame of mind as well to do that. It was a big undertaking. I'm a mom of 2 kids, and I'm also a full-time journalist. So trying to fit all of that into one thing is kind of tough. And I kind of waited as well till my children were older and a little bit easier, so I wasn't running after them all the time. And it was 2 years ago at Easter that I sat down with another Grand Chief, Alvin Fiddler. I should tell you that when Grand Chiefs are trying to tell you something, it's probably a good idea you listen to them, because Alvin gave me another good piece of advice that I'm about to tell you about. We sat down and I said to Alvin, you know, I want to write a story on the kids, on the 7 kids. And he looked at me and he said, mm-hmm. And I said, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to do it then, but I'm ready to do it now. And he said, that's good. He said, you weren't meant to do it then. You're meant to do it now. And then he told me that I needed to start somewhere. He said, you need to start with Chani Wenjack. And I said to him, who's Chani Wenjack? This was before The Secret Path. I hadn't read the Ian Adams story in Maclean's, the feature, the remarkable, wonderful feature that, as journalists, if there are any journalism students here, you should go back and read. And that was published in 1966 or 1967. It might have been published in 67. I didn't know who Chani was. And so Alvin looked at me again and he said, Chani Wenjack, go find his story. So I listened. Packed my kids up. We went to Canora. We were in Thunder Bay at the time, and so we drove out to Canora so I could see Cecilia Jeffrey Indian Residential School. Well, the school has been demolished, razed completely to the ground, but there are sort of pieces of the school that are left, really eerie pieces of the school too. There are sidewalks everywhere. You get to this part where the school was by Round Lake outside of Canora, and there's just sidewalks everywhere, and the sidewalks honestly look like they've been trampled on by legions of Roman soldiers. They're very well used, and the sidewalks just lead to nowhere because there are no buildings there anymore. What is there is Grand Council Treaty Number 3's little mini office. They have a little mini office there. It's a little blue, almost looks like a mobile home. And that's where I went to go visit with an elder by the name of Thomas White. And he's a really, really an awesome guy. If you guys ever are passing through Canora, go into Grand Council Treaty Number 3 and ask to go speak to him. Maybe he'll show you these pictures. Because when I said to him, I'm looking for information about Chani Wenjack, he got under the desk, pulled out this big black plastic suitcase that was full of photographs. And he said to me, if you're looking for Chani Wenjack, start here. So I started to go through the suitcase. And it was really sickening again, because time after time I was staring at pictures of kids who went to Cecilia Jeffrey, and nobody knew who they were. None of the kids were labeled. Like, I think maybe out of the hundreds of photos that I was looking at, perhaps maybe 5%, if that, had any names attached to them whatsoever. And I kept thinking to myself that I would want to know where my children are and how they're doing. I would like to see photographs of them. And I wondered if the parents ever got any. And why I liked this picture in particular was because this is about the time that Chani ran. I'll tell you a little bit about him, and you probably already know, but just in case you don't. He was 12 years old. He was at Cecilia Jeffrey, and it was October 1966 when he decided to run. And do you remember how I was telling you too about the weather in Thunder Bay, how it can turn on a dime? Well, in Thunder Bay, it can be lovely in October during the day, but at nighttime, oh, this is Canora, but it's sort of the same sort of weather pattern. It gets very cold at night, drops to freezing or below. And this is the standard issue of clothing at the time. This is actually the clothing that Chani was found wearing when they discovered his body. He was wearing a plaid shirt. He was wearing jeans, little leather boots, and a windbreaker jacket. So that's not very good when you're going out into the elements. And as you all know, Chani in his 12-year-old mind reasoned that since he came in by railway, he could go home by railway. And so he started walking. The only problem was home was 1,000 kilometers away. Home was a Goki Post, the Albany River, Martin Falls First Nation. He was eventually found by railway workers on the side of the tracks, and he had died of exposure. Remember how I was telling you that nobody was labeled? Well, this picture, I thought I got really lucky, and I really couldn't believe it. Because number 6 is Pearl. Pearl is Chani's sister. And I couldn't believe when I saw her face. I really couldn't believe it too, because I was talking to her on the phone, like Bluetooth in the car as I was driving to Canora. She was an amazing reference for me. I spoke many times to her and her sister Daisy about their time at Cecilia Jeffrey and their memories of their brother for the book. She was a massive help. I hope this is okay, but I was going to do a small reading too. Is that fine? Yeah? Is that okay? And then why I include this reading, I think you'll find it interesting for a number of reasons, especially since this is a talk about journalism too. This is a recollection that that Pearl had about the last time she spoke to her brother. And it's the last of many things, but I'm going to read it to you now. Sort of gives you a sense of her memory and what happened. Sorry, I have to put my glasses on. Somehow I got old. I don't know how that happened. Okay. In September 1966, 18-year-old Pearl Wenjack is bouncing on the pontoons of a plane floating on the deep, clear water of the Albany River. The pontoons mark the location of the Agoki Post Airport, which is 3.2 kilometers northeast of Martin Falls First Nation. The Wenjack family lives at Agoki Post, where the Agoki River converges with the mighty Albany River that feeds into James Bay. Agoki is a community of a few hundred people and part of the larger Martin Falls First Nation. Fir trees line the banks as far as the eye can see. On a sunny day, the river acts as a mirror, casting an endless reflection of the forest's edge. Pearl is small in stature with a slight, agile build. Her brown eyes, set back over high cheekbones, never fail to twinkle with merriment. Pearl has a fun-loving personality and a sharp mind. Her comments are always intelligent and insightful, and she always knows what is going on and with whom. She has a knack for bringing levity and ease, no matter how serious a situation, making you feel like everything will be okay. Pearl's personality would have attracted her 12-year-old brother, Chani, like a magnet. He, too, had a mischievous streak. In their busy house of 11 kids, she held a special spot for him in her heart and he for her. On that bright, late summer day, Chani stood beside Pearl, bouncing on the pontoons that were gently swaying back and forth with the flow of the river. For reasons unknown to her, Pearl's name had been left off the list of kids from the reserve who were being sent to Cecilia Jeffrey. Her siblings, Annie, Margaret, Daisy, Evelyn, Martha, Lizzie, George, and Chani, were waiting for the plane. But she was the only one who was told she would stay home that year. "Why aren't you going?" Chani asked, looking up at her older sister. "My name's not on the list," she replied. "If you aren't going, I don't want to go either," he said. It was the first time Pearl had ever heard her brother say he didn't want to return to school. Pearl told him he had to go. Their father wanted him to go to school, and all his friends were already on the plane. There was no choice here. Chani understood. After a moment of silence, he looked up at Pearl and asked her to promise her to do a few things for him. "She remembers," this is what he said. "Wash all my clothes and put them away. Put them in a box," he said, referring to the compact cardboard boxes that their cartons of eggs were delivered in. "You can have my burgundy sweater, the one that buttons up the front. Put my red cap on top of the box." He waited for a moment, and then he continued, "Look after my dogs, Matches and Animush. Make sure they don't get lost or beaten up." She agreed, but felt a twinge of unease. Then she stood back on the shoreline and watched her brother climb into the plane and take a seat. She wondered why he had asked her to pack up his clothes in a box. It was odd. That was what they did when someone died. And that was the last time she would speak to her brother. In fact, he would return in a few months after that, a couple months actually, and an inquest was held into his death. I should say when he returned, it was his body that returned, of course. Now, why I'm telling you about the inquest into his death was because, this might sound a little bit familiar to you, there were no Indigenous people on the jury at the inquest. The Chani's family actually did not know an inquest was taking place. They weren't told, they were not given any legal representation at all. And the jury actually had some interesting points. They asked some interesting questions. One of them was, why are we still doing this? Why in the late 1960s are we still taking children away from their families, their homes, their cultures, and their languages, and taking them out and putting them in these Indian residential schools? Why don't we have high schools for the kids in their home communities? That was in the 1960s. You can see where I'm going with this. Fast forward a little bit more. I love old reports and things. Because they also, too, help with arguments of sorts. And this slide I kind of like, because this slide is Canada, not the first time you've heard this. There was a report written. It was written by the Assembly of First Nations, and it was on honestly, First Nations from all across the country wrote this report, and it was delivered to the Minister of Indian Affairs on December 21st, 1972. And this report asked, like, it just laid out everything that everybody knew. And it's still, to this day, so relevant. The present school system is culturally alien to Native students, was one of the lines in the report. The report called for and asked for an overhaul of all the curriculum in Canada. They wanted local Indigenous education authorities and school boards, and they wanted equal funding for Indigenous kids. Because you see, funding still to this day in 2018 is totally different across Canada. In some places it's far worse. An Indigenous student is funded so much less than a non-Indigenous student. It's generally about $2,000 to $3,000 a difference. In some provinces it's really, really terrible, like $10,000, $11,000. The prairies. They wanted new textbooks, new material that reflected the true history of Canada, replace unsafe schools, build schools where they're needed. This is interesting too. So many kids also go into the provincial school system, so there should be Indigenous teachers in those schools too. And also, one of the things I sort of been wrapping my head around more is why are there no Indigenous trustees as well in the provincial school system? I don't think there are very many, if any. And the first Indigenous school board opened about a year and a half ago. So you can see, here's my circle again, where I'm going with this. It is 2018, and we still have students who don't have access to high school and who have to move 600, 700 kilometers away at the age of 13, 14, 15, 16, leave their parents, their language, their culture, everything they know, and come to school in Thunder Bay away from their parents. What they leave is home. They leave loving families. They leave communities that know them and love them. The communities can range in size from, as I was saying earlier, Kiwewin, about 350 people, to 1,200, 1,500 people. Sandy Lake, I think, is a little bit bigger than that. But they also normally don't speak English as their first language, a lot of the kids. They speak Ojibwe or Ojibwe. And they're leaving all of that. They're leaving places, too, where there are no traffic lights. There are no malls. There are no restaurants. They're lucky if there's a northern store in the community. And the northern store is kind of a catch-all. It sells everything from rubber boots to ham. It's really a culture shock when the kids leave and come into Thunder Bay, because Thunder Bay has things like traffic lights, and they've got malls. These are things that the kids aren't used to. When the kids do come to DFC, they're told how to cross the street, how to walk confidently. They're given pamphlets on how to ride public transit, how to put your bag down, how to let somebody sit beside you. Because these are all things that are new to the kids. They come to an environment, too, that isn't often welcoming to them. You've, I'm sure, heard in the news, and if you've read the book, you know about the daily racism that a lot of the kids face when they're going to school. And this isn't just one kid or someone's friend that this happened to. If you talk to any kid at DFC, any student, they'll tell you a story of being hit by eggs, being hit by garbage, being told that they're a dirty Indian, or being told to go back home by passing cars. They'll tell you stories about being followed in the mall. This is something that they live with daily. Which brings me back to Jethro Anderson, the first boy that I was telling you about, 15, went missing. He was lucky because he lived in a boarding home that was his aunt, Dora Morris. Amazing, awesome woman. She had one of those houses and homes that all the kids loved to go to because there's always food and there was like a comfortable place to be, and her kids were there too. And she loved Jethro like her own son. And so when he didn't come home on that Saturday evening in late October, she called the Thunder Bay Police. And the person who answered the phone said to her, "Oh, don't worry about it. He's probably just out there partying like all the other Native kids." And then he hung up. It actually took the Thunder Bay Police 6 days to launch an investigation into a missing 15-year-old boy. And by that point, Jethro's mom, Stella, had come in from Casablanca Lake. Casablanca is 600 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay. Her family came. People from our surrounding First Nations came. They were all searching for Jethro, because that's what happens when one of your own goes missing in Thunder Bay. The community gets out and they start looking. Curren, remember I was telling you about him? And I was telling you too that he's from Pikangikum First Nation. I should also tell you that the reason why I told you that was essentially so you know that, again, all of the things that the kids bring with them when they come to school. There is no suggestion whatsoever that Curren committed suicide, and you should know that too. You should also know that of the 5 kids that passed away, 5 of them were found in the water, all boys. Robin and Paul were found in their boarding homes. But the inquest, because an inquest was eventually held into their deaths, the inquest never heard a shred of evidence as to how the students got from the riverbank into the water. Paul, I remember I was telling you about him. He was the oldest because it had taken him so long to get through high school. And he was living with his mom. He'd rented a little house. And she told me in great detail, of course, the story of what happened. She told me that he was home for a little bit, and then he went out to a party for not very long. And she was in bed at around midnight when he came home. And so he forgot his key, and he was banging on the door. So she came down the stairs out of her bed, let him in. And he said to her, "I'm home, Mom, I'm home." And she said, "Okay." And she went back up to bed. She was lying there, and she heard him talking on the phone. She heard him open up a package of Mr. Noodles to make some food on the stove. And then she heard a thud. So she went running down the stairs, and she saw her son lying on the floor. And she thought that he was asleep. So she tried to wake him up, and she said, Paul, get up." And there was nothing. So she ran upstairs to get Richie. Richie was one of their boarders, and she said, "Richie, there's something wrong with Paul." So he got out of bed, and he came down the stairs, and he told her to call 911. She did. She said, "There's something wrong with my son." And 911 came. She also got a pillow, and she put the pillow under his head because she thought he was sleeping. Paul was vital signs absent, actually, when they came to get him. And why I'm telling you a little bit more about his story, too, I go on quite a bit about it in the book, but nobody called her to tell her how her son died. She didn't get a call from a doctor, a coroner, police officer, nobody. She waited 9 years till the start of an inquest to find out what happened to her son. And you know what they told her at the inquest? I had no idea. The toxicology reports showed nothing out of the ordinary. He wasn't drunk. He wasn't on something. There were minute traces of, I think it was marijuana in his system, but that was it. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes young men, too, just die of a heart ailment, a genetic problem. And so she was told, you guys should all go, your family should go and get tested to see if they have a genetic abnormality. So the whole family was tested and nothing was found. So essentially she waited all that time, and she still has no answers. That's Paul. This is a picture that hangs in her living room in Mishka. He was a drawer and a thinker. Everybody who knew Paul really liked him. So Robin, I was telling you about her. She was the only girl of 7. She was 18, from Kiwewan. She'd only been in Thunder Bay for a few days, and she was getting to know people. And sometimes teenagers, when they're getting to know people and they're doing things like on a Friday night, they go out and they drink. You know, that happens. Teenagers do that. Students do it. But she wasn't a drinker. So she drank far too much alcohol. And she ended up asphyxiating on her own vomit. She was placed in the hallway of her boarding home, and that's where she passed away. She was picked up, though, by counselors. And part of the one of the things that people do in Thunder Bay from DFC and from Mattawa to make sure their students are safe is they hire counselors to sort of drive around in vans and pick up kids and bring them home to make sure that they're safe at night, because the streets aren't safe for the kids in Thunder Bay. And sadly, though, she was brought and sort of left in the doorway. And she should have probably been taken to a hospital. Kyle Morrisseau, he is the second student from Kiwewan. And I'd like to say, too, that many hands helped me write this book. And I can talk a little bit about this more as I go on, but I really feel that this book was a culmination of many people's voices, the family's voices. Christian, his father, I sat down with him many, many times to speak about what happened to his son. And Christian is a painter, Kyle was a painter, and you might have heard of Kyle's grandfather, Norval Morrisseau. He's one of the most famed Ojibwe painters ever. And that's Kyle. It's a funny story about Kyle, too. Kyle and Christian had an art show in Ottawa, and Christian loves to tell the story because at the art show, it was one of Kyle's first art shows. Kyle sold more paintings than his dad. He definitely had a gift. That's Christian there. He's actually got a studio north of Toronto, and that's where I would go and visit with him. At the end of the inquest, I'll get to the inquest a little bit more, but there was an inquest eventually held into their deaths, and it was at the end of June 2016 when this happened. Christian, when it was over, he thought that he would feel a sense of closure or something, and he didn't feel anything at all. He just felt the same pain that he always felt. So that night the inquest ended, he started to paint, and this is what he painted. This is a massive, massive canvas, and it is called Seven Fallen Feathers. And the reason why he called it that was he was sick and tired of hearing journalists and the media always say, and myself included, you know, the 7 dead students. He didn't want them called that anymore, because, and as he rightly says, every child came from a loving home and a family and a community. Every child was their own person. And so this was the painting that he did. That's Robin there with the yellow, almost looks like shoulder pads. She was the only girl, so she's sort of put in a place of importance there. And Kyle is on the far right above there. He's the tallest figure. And this is their journey to the afterlife. You see little red strings that go up towards the drum. That's their sort of souls passing. And the little red figures there are the elders waiting for them to take them on to the afterlife. And that's Norval waiting for, on the top right, the far right's little red figure, to take Kyle. So Christian, I should also tell you, that's where the painting comes from on the book, and the title. Many hands. And this is Jordan. Jordan, do you remember I was telling you about Daniel, Stan's son? Daniel was a star goalie, and so was Jordan. And that's him there with the baseball cap on that's backwards, it's gray, and he's got the gray sort of shiny shirt on. And he's from Webequie, and he was a really amazing hockey player. And he really wanted to go to Thunder Bay to play competitive hockey. He wanted to be a hockey player. And of course, when he got to Thunder Bay, he fit right in with the team. And I took this picture at the end of the inquest. The inquest finished at the end of June 2016. That's Bernice on the far right, and she's addressing the media at the end of the inquest. The inquest, 145 recommendations were made after an 8-month-long inquest. It was the second largest inquest in Ontario's history. A lot of those recommendations are still yet to be carried out. One of the top recommendations is the same recommendation that comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that is having schools for children, high schools for them, in their home communities. And it's 2018, folks, and we're still trying to do that. So that takes us to where we are here now. I wrote quite a few of these stories too in the Star, sort of news stories about what was going on. After the inquest ended, the provincial government stepped in, and an offshoot of the Ministry of the Attorney General's office, the Independent Police Review Director, they started to investigate the Thunder Bay Police Force for systemic racism concerning most Indigenous and missing person cases. They've reopened almost 30 death investigations. Most of them are Indigenous, some are not, and what they're doing is comparing how those cases were handled against non-Indigenous cases. Another 9 cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls are also being reviewed. The Thunder Bay Police Board, and it's their job to look after and police the police, is also being investigated by the province, and the lead investigator of that is Senator Murray Sinclair. And so if that doesn't tell you the gravity of what's going on in Thunder Bay, I just don't know what else will. And once I finished the book too, I thought I was done, but I wasn't done. I ended up having to write an epilogue. It was something that none of us expected, and it was something, I have to tell you, that just devastated the entire community in Thunder Bay, all the families, everyone. Because on May 6th, 2 more young people, 2 more youth, disappeared on the same night, and within 2.5 weeks, both of their bodies would be found in the McIntyre River system. Tammy Kiash was 17, Josiah Begg, 14. So, the title of my talk was Rights Before Reconciliation. I hope you understand now why I titled it that. And it is an interesting journey for me too as a reporter, because, you know, our job is to tell the stories of people whose voices are not being heard. So I get a lot of questions too, like, well, what are you? Are you an activist? Are you a journalist? Are you an advocate? Are you all these things? Is that okay? I like to think that I wrote the stories that nobody was listening to at the time, and how could I not stand up and talk about this? How can I not tell you what I saw? How could I not tell you the stories of the families who have participated in the book? Most of them have. I didn't speak to Curren's family. Curren's family also didn't participate in the inquest. But, and this is different too. As a journalist, we would never do this, but as an author, I did this. I shared the chapters of the book with the families. I would call Jordan's mom, and I would read to her parts of the book, and she wouldn't say anything. She would say, mm-hmm. It was a very one-sided conversation. And I remember at the very end of our conversations, she just said, send it to me. So I sent it to her. And she called me back. This was like days before we were publishing, like days. It was crazy. And she said, you've made 3 errors. I'm like, okay, what are they? And so she told me. She's like, this name is wrong. this thing's wrong. No, this is, I was over here, I wasn't there. And she said one other thing. And then she said, thank you. And I also went through the chapters with all the other families that were affected as much as I could. That was also an interesting process too, and I really tried to change things that they said were wrong. And that's interesting as a journalist as well, because sometimes memories fade. Sometimes over time, you know, how you remember something is different than what was. And in one instance where we had a bit of an issue, we decided after much discussion to use what was offered at the inquest with a little asterisk in the footnotes. My footnotes are very long, you know, see, and they took me forever. They almost ended me, I'm going to say, writing those at the very end. So you can see many hands did help me write this book. It wasn't just me. I like to think that this is the voice of the communities in Nan and the families, and I really did write this to honor them and for people to remember them. Because I know that they hope that their children didn't die in vain, and that maybe one day things are going to finally get better and things are going to finally change. I hope. And I always end my talks too with saying that it's like, I wish I could write a happy ending to this story, but there isn't really one for me to write at this point. And the happy ending is actually up to all of you and to the Indigenous people in this country to make it better. And with that, I'm going to say Chimigwich, and I will take any questions.
Hi there. Thanks so much for coming. So my partner is actually a journalist in Thunder Bay, and I'm asking this on behalf of her. She says that a lot of people in her hometown are very defensive when you raise these sorts of issues. They don't accept the realities of the racism, and just wondering if you could speak to that phenomenon and how this book and the reporting on the inquest was received with that sort of, I guess, attitude of people in Thunder Bay in mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm hopeful that it's getting a little bit better in Thunder Bay. Her hometown being Thunder Bay, right? Okay. Well, that's two different perspectives, isn't it? Like, you know, as I was saying, what I have witnessed in Thunder Bay and what I know of Thunder Bay, and after hearing from the kids and talking to them and seeing also too the true statistics. I mean, I don't make this up. Statistics Canada said that Thunder Bay was a hate crime capital of the country last year. Barbara Kensner was killed after a metal hitch was thrown out of a window and struck her in the stomach. And of course, you all probably know too that her sister, who was walking with her at the time, heard somebody that was in the car say, "I got one of them." It's a reality, you know. I think Thunder Bay is working to make it better. I would hope that they are. The OIPRD investigation, the investigation into the police board, these are all positive developments. And I know the school boards are working, which they didn't before. I mean, like before, there's always been this sort of silos with this is the federal school, right? The federally funded school. And here are the provincial schools with the provincial boards that are funded properly. Keep in mind, DFC forever wasn't. Like, it had that funding discrepancy, and they're working with less. And every time they've got to fly a child home, that comes out of budgets. So the pool of money gets less and less and less that they've got to work with. I'm happy to say that I do know the Ontario Ministry of Education is really, they've told the school boards, okay, people, stop this. Reach your hand over. Let's try and figure something out here. And I'm hopeful that something will happen that way. There's talk of, I know DFC has asked, like, maybe we can get some busing happening for our students so they don't have to take public transit. There's talk of, maybe combining some PD days so that all the teachers can get together and get to know each other. And I would hope those are positive steps by people living in the community. And I really can't answer more than that, but that's her experience. And yeah, I just hope it gets better.
One more question over there. Right, we're going to lose the room soon, so one more question.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for. Thank you for your talk. I'm just curious about the Every Child Matters shirt that the child is wearing. I'm ashamed to say I don't know anything about that. Was that some sort of general awareness movement that was started?
Yep. Every September, is it the 28th? 29th? 30th? Okay. 30th? 30th, okay, thank you. I know it's one of those days. All across Canada, it's Orange Shirt Day. It's a day to remember residential school survivors. And in Thunder Bay, this was one of the Orange Shirt Days I attended a couple years ago. It's a really powerful, awesome day. We walk from the city center in Thunder Bay, and we go to the site of the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School, which is a residential school that Norval Morrisseau attended. And until last year, there was nothing to signify or to remember that a residential school was right downtown Thunder Bay. And so everybody would walk from the city center of Thunder Bay, the municipal offices, with all of their own shirts, and we'd walk over to the Catholic primary school that is built on the site of the St. Joseph's Indian Residential School. And everyone would go to the corner of the yard, because that's where the residential school was. And there's a drumming circle, and everyone remembers. Finally, a monument has been put up, little thing. You're shaking your head, you've seen it. That's a whole other story, though. And there's also a mural up in the school. And the mural is really cool, and the mural was actually got together by Fiddler, who is Alvin Fiddler's wife, and she's an educator, an awesome, amazing voice for change in Thunder Bay. Tisa is. I hope that answers your questions. There's walks everywhere. There are walks in Toronto, Vancouver, everywhere. Mm-hmm.
Just to add, the orange shirt represents.
Oh yes, that's a good story.
The girl, I can't remember her name, but she was in Vancouver, and she received an orange shirt from her cocoa, and that was the last thing she had. And when she got to the
school,
the nuns took it away from her and burned it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's
that's right.
Symbolic, very important.
Yeah, that's right. You remember her name? Did you? No.
Yeah, thank you for coming in today and talking to us. My question is for emerging journalists, or just any journalists in general, and that don't have extensive knowledge in history with Indigenous cultures. What advice could you give them in their writing or on the reporting to not promote or to enhance, I guess, the representation on Indigenous cultures, or to not try to admit or promote bias, I guess, in their writing? But more importantly, how can they prevent that bias if they don't really have the, I guess, experience in culture, but they want to bring about those important issues?
Thanks for that question. Duncan McHugh from CBC, he's put together a reporter's guide for exactly that, for people who may not be very familiar with Indigenous communities, and it's available online. Look up riic.ca, and you'll see it's a reporter's guide to covering an Indigenous story, or a story about Indigenous people. It'll be very helpful to you. I urge you to read, to write. Read CBC Indigenous. Check out APTN. APTN is awesome. They do great stories. They've got, flick it on sometimes if you're at home. It's on your cable service and you're making dinner. They've got movies too, Indigenous movies. Like it's awesome. They've got everything. Longmire. I love Longmire. Yeah, you could watch everything really. Listen to podcasts. Listen to Finding Cleo. Connie Walker, my friend Connie Walker, spent a year doing a remarkable podcast. She also did one on murdered missing Indigenous women and girls right before that. Listen to those, learn. I'm hoping that the curriculums are going to change for kids. It's too late for all of us, but for kids in elementary school and in high school, and they're going to get sort of better grounding of the real history of this country. I think that that's finally going to happen. But until then, do things like that. Podcasts, APTN, RIIC.ca, Duncan McHugh. You'll see the guide.
Read TRC.
Oh yeah, and then there's a Read the TRC. You can do that too. Highly recommend that. And there's 90 calls to action too that come out of that report. So if you don't get through the whole 700 and so pages, which is actually very incredibly written too, I have to tell you. For when I was writing this book, when I didn't know how to say something, a lot of the time, I would go and I would read what Marie Sinclair had written, and I would feel so inspired. And I'm like, oh, right, that's what it means. And I would, it was such a big help to me. So I do urge you, that's a very good suggestion, thank you, to read that. But if you can't even do that, look for the 90 calls to action. And as he says, if every one of us took one call to action, just one, and applied it to your life, that makes a difference too. Oh, and you do, yes.
Well, I just wanted to address the person talking about Orange Shirt Day. So, Sayo, my name's Zita, and I work at Indigenous Services here at Western. And something we do every year is we make shirts and we do observe that day here on campus. So, for anyone who's interested in purchasing an orange shirt or taking part in that day, I would really encourage you to connect with our office. We actually have a bunch of orange shirts left over from last year. If you want to get a shirt, let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more quick question here.
Hi, I'm Jill. I'm actually born and raised from Sioux Lookout, Ontario, and I got your book for Christmas. And reading it, I learned so much about the history that I did not learn in school. Not in regards to the residential schools, because we're quite familiar with that, but it was really beautiful for me to read something that was written from a completely different perspective. And given that I still go back to Sioux Lookout and know the Beardies and know these families that you're talking about, I think it was really, really lovely to read. And as people who know those families, to see the justice that was served, I guess, in your book. So I just wanted to thank you for that, because I haven't seen that perspective. Not to say that I haven't heard about it and discussed, but to see it on paper and then sharing it with other people has been, like, I'm a white girl from Sioux Lookout, and it was pretty nice to be able to say, this is fabulous.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
And I guess that's my chance to say thank you for coming and giving this talk. I think it's now kind of up to us to take some action to make the happy ending happen. Because I think it's one thing to hear and to learn, but also then we need to do something. So thank you very much, Tanya, for being here.
Thank you.